Thank you, Jolene, and welcome to all of you attending today's webinar. I am absolutely delighted to have you here with us today. We have an incredibly important discussion. And for those of you who are new to AMAC, a little background. It was my father, the late and great Dan Weber, who founded AMAC as an alternative for conservative Americans who were looking for something other than the AARP. Today, we are more than 2 million members strong, and we are creating a movement of like-minded people and patriots who can really help us preserve this great country that we all love so much. We began the AMAC Foundation to provide Social Security advice and Medicare advice to all Americans at no cost, of course, and those services continue to grow. I am so excited to share with you some new developments. In addition to offering Social Security and Medicare advice, we're expanding our services to include educational programming, just like this webinar here today, so that we really can empower thousands of Americans like you to be informed on the issues that really matter most to the 50-plus population. Just a few weeks ago, we witnessed a historic election with Donald J. Trump being elected. He won a resounding victory. He became the first Republican president really to win the popular vote in over 20 years. And so I'm delighted that today you'll be hearing from our incredible panelists. We have 3 panelists who are going to take us through how we got here and where we can expect to go, particularly in the first 100 days. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brittany Baldwin. Brittany is a senior advisor at AMAC and a former White House speechwriter for President Trump, and she'll be moderating our panel today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, and it's really an honor to have you here. Thank you for your fearless leadership of AMAC, and I want to give a warm welcome to all of our AMAC members and friends who are here with us today. We're delighted that you've joined us, and we're also delighted to have 3 esteemed panelists with us, and I'll introduce them before we jump into the questions. So first, we have Andy Mangione, who serves as a Senior Vice President of AMAC Action, where he directs grassroots advocacy at both the state and federal level. He is also responsible for the strategy, messaging, and execution of AMAC Action's numerous call to action campaigns that activate hundreds of thousands of AMAC members. Maybe some of you on this webinar have joined those. Andy also serves as a national spokesperson for AMAC. We also have with us Samantha Mims, who is the Director of Data and Cybersecurity Policy at the America First Policy Institute. Sam previously served as the data director for President Donald Trump's re-election campaign and Governor Ron DeSantis's governor campaign. Prior to her foray in politics, Sam played on the U.S. indoor and beach volleyball teams, and we've really enjoyed working with Sam over this past year. Sam, it's just a delight to have you with us, and we're looking forward to hearing from your deep dive into some of the numbers behind the win. So thank you. And last but not least, we have James Baer with us, who is the special counsel at the Pelican Institute for Public Policy, where he litigates constitutional cases in Louisiana and the Fifth Circuit. He also serves as a lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps Reserves, and he previously served on the White House Domestic Policy Council and as a federal prosecutor at the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Orleans. So thank you all for being here. I'm really looking forward to our discussion today. And with that, we'll jump right in. And as Jolene already said, we do plan to leave some time for questions at the end. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A section or in the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. So the first question I'd like to ask goes to Sam. Sam, as Rebecca mentioned, this was a historic election on so many levels. For starters, it was the first time that a Republican nominee won the popular vote since 2004. A big picture, can you talk a little bit about how Trump won such a resounding victory?
Yeah, and talk about historic. I mean, it was a historic election because President Trump is a historic candidate. And how did he get this historic victory? I think it was a combination of 3 things. Strategic outreach, key messaging, and for the first time really on the Republican side, an empowered coalition. And so kind of touching on that first thing, a combination of strategic outreach. So we really focus, you saw the Republican voters really focus on low propensity voters. But historically, Republicans really struggled reaching low propensity voters because none of our data apparatuses talk to each other. So if you're on the left, there's one database, everyone uses it. They're singing from the same song sheet. They all have, the same marching orders. Whereas on the Republican side, you have, three main databases and none of them talk to each other. And there's very little coordination, win, lose, or draw, campaigns have an end date and that data just goes away. And I think something we realized this time was that data needs to live on and it needs to have a permanent home. So at America First Works, we built what's now called Data Command, which is built off of what we built for President Trump. So it's very large. It's, got a lot of data points. It's really incredible. But the other thing we realized is not one group can target all of these low propensity voters alone. So that's where that empowered coalition that really hadn't existed before on the Republican side came into play. So at America First Works, America First Policy Institute, we realized we needed partners. And so it started in January. We brought together 7 partners. AMAC was one of the first 7. And by the end of Election Day, it grew to over 100 different groups. And I don't think you've ever seen people work together like that before. Andy and Brittany were on calls every week. Bob was on calls every week. And not only were we all working together, we were sharing data for the first time. We were sharing messaging for the first time. And I think that messaging was the third and final part I really want to touch on as to why this was a resounding victory. I think the radical left made a fatal error when calculating what messages they cared about versus what the American people cared about. And President Trump is the best messenger that the political game has ever seen. He knows what the American people care about, and he knows how to reach them. And he was willing to do things differently, not just on the data front, but he went on podcasts. He did the things that Kamala Harris simply wasn't willing to do. And I think the American people said, hey, I want to return to a promises made, promises kept president.
Incredible. Thank you, Sam. That was an amazing overview. Andy, I'd love to hear a little bit from you about the AMAC Action's advocacy efforts this election season. Can you give us the highlights of how AMAC members, likely many of whom are here with us today, played a critical role in this election?
Well, Brittany, we ran a 6-month campaign asking AMAC members to serve as the conservative eyes on this election by working as poll observers and election workers in 13 critical states. Over 2,500 AMAC members responded to our request to work the polls in important swing states like Georgia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, which, as you know, were all won by President Trump. Now, we ran a poll in late August asking our members how they plan to vote. We wanted to get a feel if they were going to vote early. And we saw a 50-50 split between AMAC members who said they would vote on Election Day and those who would vote early. And we wanted to change that number. So we highlighted why it was so critical to vote early as we published articles detailing the importance of voting early. We posted other media and videos, and we deployed a call to action campaign that included messaging urging people to vote early. And in an early November poll, this was a follow-up. We were pleased to see that AMAC members by a 5-to-1 margin said they had already voted early. So that was great. We also ran a multiple state call to action campaign where we drilled down specific issues. Now, these were issues concerning election integrity, issues concerning life, and parental rights issues. And the purpose here was to cut through all the confusion by well-funded dark money groups that were spreading misinformation on these issues. We ran these campaigns in 18 states, and AMAC members helped generate successful outcomes in 15 of them. So our members were all over this election, and they were very, very involved.
Amazing. And to all the members on this webinar today who helped, we thank all of you from the bottom of our heart. We're grateful because we know that our members, AMAC's members, are what make us who we are and what enable us to help save America. So thank you, Andy, for leading those efforts. James, I'd love to hear from you about what we might be able to think through as far as thinking about President Trump's win and how policy played a role, how do you think his first term impacted the President Trump's victory this second term?
Absolutely, Brittany. And I think we had a really unique situation, of course, where we had a president who had a proven track record of success several years ago. And a lot of that was the work that we did in the White House. And that work was through the policy councils. And I was blessed to be able to work on the Domestic Policy Council, which focused on agencies that deal with domestic policy, such as healthcare, the VA, education. There are other policy councils in the White House, the NSC, the National Economic Council, and others that basically develop policy, work on legislation, and ultimately work with the agencies to try and ensure that the president's vision is accomplished. This was such a unique election because President Trump had already been president for 4 years. It was easy to point to people to the fact that their lives were better 4 years ago. You can think about several elements of his agenda from his first term. Firstly, economic stability. The worst thing possible for folks like seniors who are on fixed income or older Americans who are on pensions is inflation. And we had inflation under control under President Trump's term through wise economic policies. We had tax cuts that had put more money into Americans' pockets. We had a focus on ensuring that the border was safe and that there was public order. We've seen over the last 4 years decays in public order. You go into Walgreens, you can't get the items you want because you have to call the attendant because it's behind some security screen. So President Trump's focus on law and order was very important. And we had him do innovative things for healthcare and for prescription costs, which are particularly important, I believe, for your membership. Expanding telehealth, working to lower prescription drug prices. And of course, we had a world that was largely in peace and stability versus the last 4 years we've seen chaos, instability, humiliating situations such as the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I think all of these things played in to people's calculus. While the left tried to say that Trump was the worst thing that could ever happen, President Trump and his team could always point to, how were you doing 4 years ago? You were doing better when we were in charge.
Thank you, James. And I know many of us are looking forward to hopefully doing a lot better over the next 4 years. So we're looking forward to hopefully gas prices and grocery prices, among others, going down. Sam, I'd love to go a little bit deeper into the data. We saw some monumental demographic shifts this election. Trump won a majority of Hispanic men. Overall, he gained 14 points with Hispanic voters compared to 2020, 7 points with voters aged 18 to 29, and he doubled his standing with Black men, among many other demographic gains. I'd love to start by asking, why do you think we saw such unprecedented shifts such as these?
Yeah, to kind of retouch what I said earlier, we saw this monumental, unprecedented shift in the electorate because President Donald Trump is a monumental and unprecedented candidate. He outworked, even at McDonald's, and outsmarted Kamala Harris. Democrats, I think it's really funny to look when they're taking a break from their infighting post-mortem, and they're asking the questions like they asked Bill Clinton the other day, are we ever going to be ready for a female president? And I think that just shows you that they're asking the wrong questions still to this day, because I think we and everyone on this call knows that the radical left's doesn't include America First conservatives. And I think the left, this election was actually about fairness. It's unfair to use the Department of Justice to raid people's homes unjustly. It's unfair to allow men in women's locker rooms. It's unfair that people like Laken Riley aren't safe by, running for a job or going for a job. And so I think one thing I would challenge AMAC members to look at is when you see those we questions, you should ask, who is that we you're talking about? Because if you're talking about we, when bicycles were invented, we weren't ready for the impact women were going to have on the workforce. That wasn't a thing back then. But I'm going to highlight two specific groups that a lot of people aren't talking about. And if you look at those we people, the we actually was the American people wanting to return to a promises made, promises kept president. And I think the left bet too big on abortion and they went too far in gender radicalization. And President Trump met the moment, and those new groups said, you may not be traditionally Republican, but guess what? There's a place in the America First movement for you too. So one of those groups is the Muslims. So that was like kind of a hot topic in this past election. I don't think anyone had it on their bingo card that Dearborn, Michigan was going to flip for Donald J. Trump for the first time ever, and for a Republican ever. And for those of you who don't know Dearborn, Michigan, it is the highest concentration of Arab Americans in the United States. I don't think anyone going back even into 2016 thought that that's a population that would support, you know, an America First leader. But guess what? People said, I don't want, you know, gender radicalization in my kids' schools. It was actually funny. One of our door knockers who we had, they spoke Arabic. They were from the community. They actually encountered Kamala Harris door knockers about 3 weeks left into the campaign who were from Georgia and North Carolina, because they were abandoning those states and they were trying to come into community that was not theirs with a message that did not resonate with the population. And people said, hey, wait a second, maybe this Donald Trump guy is more like me. You know, it's not always what I've been told that I have to vote Democrat. And the other population that people aren't talking about, we hear a lot about the male vote for President Donald Trump. And yes, there were some really monumental shifts with the male vote. But the female vote, I think, is the more interesting story that hasn't really been told. And the only hard data that we have right now is the early and absentee data. So we actually know who voted. Obviously, we don't know how, you know, individuals, but we know actually what individuals voted earlier absentee. So the states won't release that for election day voters until about March or June, you know, if Arizona's done counting ballots by then. But if you look at the difference between how many conservative women voted early in 2020 versus how many conservative women voted earlier absentee in 2024, we actually gained about 140,000 across the 7 battleground states. If you look at Democrat women, you know, from 2020 to 2024, they lost 540,000 female voters across those same 7 states. So that's not a population that is very easy to make up. And I'll talk about, you know, some other states, I think maybe later, but those are just huge grounds with populations that I don't think the left really expected to have that big of a gap with.
Amazing. Sam, just one follow-up question for you, and we'll keep moving on too. But could you just speak a little bit about how seniors played a role in this election?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to give kudos to the AMAC and AMAC action teams, you know, and especially the members who are here on this call, because we saw senior support for President Trump decrease from 2016 to 2020. So we knew going into 2024, the senior population was not only going to be mission critical, but we're going to have to make up some ground. And we couldn't have done that without some great partners like AMAC and AMAC Action. And a lot of people talk about exit polls and how President Trump didn't do as well with the 65 up in voters as, you know, he did 45 to 64 year old voters. And I challenge people because, one, those are exit polls. So they're a lot of times, especially those numbers, they include a variety of states, including blue ones, that can really skew the deciding states data. So actually, I mentioned that the only raw data we have is our absentee and early voting right now. So I actually think President Trump's numbers with seniors will do better once that election day number comes in, because as we know, a lot of America First voters do vote on election day. But I'll give you an example from a state like Pennsylvania, a historically bluish purple state that we flipped. The exit polls for President Trump that show he had a 54-45 lead among 45 to 6-year-old voters. And his lead with 65 and up voters was 52-46. In Arizona, another swing state that we flipped with a very significantly large senior population. I believe there's a lot of AMAC members there. President Trump led 45 to 6-year-olds, 64-year-olds, 53-46, I think. 65 and up was 57-42. Georgia, another swing state. President Trump led 45 to 64-year-olds, 56-43, and that margin for 65 and up increased to 60-39. So you can tell a lot of stories with the same set of data. It's just a matter of looking past the headlines that a radical left is pushing, because oftentimes you find a completely different story. And I don't know if I have time for another Pennsylvania example, but that's the TED Talk on especially the senior populations.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sam. That is very revealing, and it's not what you will find on the headlines of AARP, for example. Andy, I'd love to ask you a little bit about just in your work with so many of our AMAC members, like those on the calls, what were the issues that consistently are important to our members? And then I'd love to hear a little bit about some of the historic call to action campaigns that our members have been involved in this year, and just a few highlights of that.
Sure, Brittany. Election integrity and illegal immigration, I would say, were the two issues that we heard the most comments, the most complaints, the most concern about this year, and probably throughout the Biden administration. AMAC members want their vote to count, and they know that without free and fair elections, we do not have a representative republic. That's why so many of them committed to working the polls. They knew we needed as much conservative scrutiny as possible for this election, and they stepped up big time when we asked them. Now, this concern for election integrity kind of goes hand in hand with illegal immigration. First, AMAC members were gravely concerned about illegal immigrants voting in our elections. And they showed this concern by responding throughout the year to call to action campaigns to support citizen-only voting measures in states throughout the country, not to mention the issues that were on the ballot in the general election. And second, AMAC members realize that sovereign nations lose their sovereignty with open borders. They're greatly concerned that America's sovereignty is threatened with Biden's open borders policy, but they're not opposed to people coming into this country. They just want our laws and processes to be upheld and respected. Now, with respect to the call to action campaigns where we saw high levels of engagement, a couple of them come to mind, Brittany. First, over the summer, over 19,000 messages were sent by AMAC members to the U.S. House of Representatives in support of the Safeguarding American Voter Eligibility, or SAVE Act. And if you recall, this is the bill that requires states to obtain documentary proof of citizenship when registering people to vote in federal elections. And it also requires states to remove non-citizens from their rolls. And thanks in part to AMAC members, the SAVE Act passed the House in July. Speaker Mike Johnson personally thanked AMAC members for their help in getting the bill across the finish line. Now we just need to get it passed in the new Congress. And second, and most recently, and this was pretty amazing, we saw a tremendous response to a campaign that we ran last week in Michigan, where the lame duck Democrats were trying to push through a vote on the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact before the new House is seated in January. Our members rallied with over 2,400 messages sent to the 110 members of the Michigan State House, telling them to oppose these bills. And in the wake of all this opposition, Brittany, the bills were pulled and the vote was canceled. AMAC members, and this is what's important, and this is what kind of amazes me, AMAC members generated this response in about 36 hours, and their quick action produced this great result.
Amazing. So you can definitely see that at AMAC and across great organizations too, like AFPI, we're definitely not sitting on our laurels. We're not just, reveling in an exciting election, but we're continuing to act, and AMAC action is continuing to make a difference with so many AMAC members participating. So thank you for that, Andy. James, we've also heard, the saying goes, personnel is policy. What do you make of Trump's cabinet picks so far?
Well, I think that we've gotten to see some of the cabinet picks laid out. I feel like we've gotten a lot more attention than maybe the average cabinet pick process gets. President Trump, during his entire time in the White House, and something that we experience, he loves people with a strong, diverse set of viewpoints coming forward, and then he evaluates the options and makes clear decisions and moves forward. We've got a couple of categories of folks who have been named for cabinet positions. We've got folks who obviously have significant government or public sector experience. Those include people like Senator Marco Rubio, who's going to be Secretary of State, Matt Whitaker, who's been named as NATO ambassador, another great gentleman with lots of law enforcement experience as well. Mr. Tom Homan, who's going to be the border czar. Speaking of the issue of immigration, he's got decades of government experience and at enforcing our nation's immigration laws. We have folks who have private sector experience. We talked about Linda McMahon. She's a wonderful person. She's served in all sorts of different capacities. She was the small business administration leader in the last administration. She's obviously run a successful business. She's also chair of AFPI, so she's got experience with the policy and the think tank world. So she brings a great deal to bear. And then you see some of the folks who get a lot of attention are, kind of more innovative thinkers that President Trump has brought in. Those include folks like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And their focus, I think, is going to be important because they're looking at issues that have been potentially overlooked. Problems such as childhood health, childhood obesity, increases in autism and diabetes, and issues like the fact that our nation's health, unfortunately, appears to be in decline. So President Trump is surrounding himself with a wide variety of advisors, and I think he's going to be very effective at listening to their counsel and making wise choices for the next 4 years.
Super informative. Thank you for that. And one follow-up question is, for those who are less familiar with the swamp, what is actually happening right now during this transition? Could you walk us through kind of what happens during the transition?
Absolutely. So during the transition phase, there's a personnel process going on, right? Where we're seeing that play out in the press, and different individuals are being selected for different roles in the incoming administration. We also know that there's significant policy work that's going on in preparation for the first 100 days. It's going to be so important for President Trump to begin strong. He has a clear, decisive mandate, and he wants to begin with effective actions to address the issues we raised, issues like inflation, issues like energy dominance, issues like immigration. And he has the power to do quite a bit of that through his executive actions, but also through legislative actions. And so during this period, people are bringing together different proposals and ideas and putting forward proposing personnel to fill the important roles in the government. There are over 4,000 roles in the federal government, political roles that need to be filled. So the president's team is culling through patriotic Americans that want to join in his vision to make America a better place.
Thank you, James. That's really helpful. Andy, speaking of this time of transition, we obviously right now have what's often known as a lame duck Congress, where during this few months before the new Congress is sworn in, sometimes you see different shenanigans happen where they're going to try to get something passed that maybe they couldn't get passed when they have both Republican houses. Is there anything that we should be on the lookout for as far as kind of dangerous or concerning legislation?
I love the word shenanigans. It's one of my favorite words, Brittany. But lame duck sessions tend to be lame, and given the Republican sweep, and that's what's most important. Given the Republican sweep, limited deal making is likely to happen for the remainder of the year. Republicans would rather have their members seated than enact their own agenda. Now, for the lame duck session, Congress must pass government funding by December 20th. Speaker Johnson announced that he would do so by passing another continuing resolution. You want to look for Republicans to insist on spending cuts as a condition of passing government funding for next year. As far as AMAC action, and from our perspective, we're pushing for inclusion of PBM reforms to help lower costs of prescription drugs for seniors. And we're optimistic that this could finally happen, or this could actually happen in December. The reason for the optimism is that Congress is expected to extend telehealth flexibilities, and some PBM reforms could help finance this extension. As far as things to be wary of, the Democrats are attempting to steal a Senate seat in Pennsylvania, and we will likely see lawsuits over the McCormick seat. And Democrats are rushing to confirm liberal judges, so we need to encourage all Republican senators not to miss votes at the end of this year.
Amazing. That's a really helpful overview. Thank you, Andy. You wouldn't necessarily hear that if you just watched some of the mainstream news. So thank you for the insider look into that. Sam, what does Trump need to do to deliver to these expanded constituencies that he's built? And especially when it comes to an agenda that is going to deliver results for working class voters.
Yeah, and going back to the name of the game here, it's that first 100 days. Like Andy said, there was a Republican sweep. It was not, President Trump led the victory for the Senate. He led the victory for us to retain the House. And by us, I mean, the America First movement. And I think so one of the things we did was we sent messages prior to the election day to about 30 million. We sent about 30 million text messages, and they weren't those spam fundraising texts that you get, donate now or else something bad will happen. But we paired that with video messages about issues that we thought people cared about based on our modeling. And we've actually already sent 5 million of those text messages since election day. And it was a very simple message. It was, the America First movement wants to hear from you. What should the next administration tackle on day one? And you looking at President Trump's platform that he's released, it's 20 different points. All of those top responses, so we looked at our top 5 responses, and all of them were on President Trump's platform. They are that mandate that the American people has now given to us as the America First, movement. It was seal the border and stop the migrant invasion, mass deportations, no tax on tips, end the weaponization of government, and world peace. And I think all of those, whether it's those coalitions we talked about, whether it's increasing in Black males or women, or, with groups like Muslim voters who are typically not conservatives traditionally, they care about all 5 of those. And those are resoundingly the issues we keep bringing up and talking about world peace, whether on one side of issues or the other. I think a lot of Americans are thinking, why are we spending so much money at home? I don't receive those paychecks that other governments and the illegal immigrants get. And for me, it was personal. At the end of the day, I'm an American just like the rest of the people on this call. My husband's going to go to Iraq next year. I very much wanted him to go over under an America First leader than an America Last leader, because we've seen what that leadership brings us. And I think a lot of American people felt the same way.
Thank you, Sam. That's really helpful. I know we want to make sure we get to have a chance to really dig into the first 100 days. So James, I'm going to ask you to help us here in thinking through, helping us know what to expect in the first 100 days. But let's start with the first day. We know that oftentimes the first day in office is a symbolic day for the president to pass or to sign executive orders that really put a mark on what he wants to define as priorities in his time in office. What do you think we might see during his first day as far as executive actions might go?
So as you all know, there are very few chances in life where you get to get a do-over in something, right? There are very few chances you get to go back to kindergarten and relive knowing everything you know now and the knowledge you know now. And President Trump and his advisors, fortunately, have gotten that chance because of the American people's faith. And so, they're going back in ready to go. We had so many amazing ideas and executive orders that we developed and thought through on Domestic Policy Council. And so many of them, unfortunately, were canceled almost immediately by President Biden, even ones you would think were completely uncontroversial. I wrote an executive order on protecting law enforcement that Biden revoked. So day one, President Trump can immediately reinstate all of his executive orders. He had game-changing executive orders that went to the heart of the administrative state, such as ensuring that government employees that give political advice are considered political advisors rather than just government workers. There's so many of these that are important to addressing, how large our government has gotten and how out of control it is. Somebody in the chat also mentioned when I was talking about the cabinet, Elon and Vivek, and their focus is largely on deregulation and taking an innovative approach. So on day one, President Trump can reinstate all of the great executive orders he had. He can also rescind all of the Biden executive orders that are just completely out there. President Biden sought to use the military and other agencies for his kind of social agenda. And some of these very, outrageous actions that the American people responded to very strongly and said, we don't want this to continue. So President Trump can certainly rescind all of those. But there's a lot of new ideas. And for the last 4 years, the president's former advisors, the president, his team have been developing new ideas. And on day one, I think you're going to see in the buckets of the main issues we've been talking about, which are immigration. Of course, we can go back to President Trump's policies to secure the border. and use our funds and our abilities to strengthen the border wall and make sure that, these asylum seekers remain in Mexico and don't come to the US. You're going to see, of course, energy dominance, right? All of the efforts that the Biden administration did to shut down energy, which is so important in driving inflation, right? The cost of your gas drives everything in our economy because of the shipping and transportation. And you're going to see President Trump seek to be, stronger on the world stage, of course. And you're ultimately going to see President Trump seeking to reform, education and the government writ large. So some of these can be done through executive orders. Quite a few can. And, folks have been working on those and thinking through those and gaming those out. But some, of course, require legislation, and that will be a little longer term project. But certainly on day one, we're going to see President Trump reinstate quite a few orders and continue to address his primary policy issues.
Super interesting. And let's talk about some of the big ticket legislative items in the first 100 days. What do you think we could expect to see on the legislative side of things?
I think we'll see an effort at border security. If you'll remember, there were some proposals. They weren't strong enough. Trump won decisively on this issue. We know that, we were in a situation where apartment buildings in Colorado were being taken over by gangs of illegal aliens. So this was a pressing issue the American people cared deeply about. And I think you're going to see border security be a primary issue. I think tax reform and economics are going to be a huge issue. Obviously, the president's tax cuts that President Trump's tax cuts he passed have to come up again for evaluation. And, we want to see continued tax reform that puts more money in the pockets of people, especially working people, as Sam mentioned, with some of the policy proposals. And then we're going to see efforts at energy independence. We want to, as President Trump said, drill, baby, drill. We want to use the incredible power that we have under our ground, our energy, to really drive our economy forward. I think you'll see efforts at additional crime and safety, resolving those issues for Americans. Violent crime is a huge issue for Americans. So the issues that have been campaigned on, the issues that are on President Trump's platform available on Agenda 47 are going to be those first 100-day issues. And the big ones, I think, are the border security issues and the tax reform, because those require legislative fixes.
Super interesting. Now, on tax reform, President Trump has thrown into the mix a few new ideas from his Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that he passed in 2017. Among them is, no tax on tips, but then there's also the idea of no tax on Social Security, which directly affects many people on this call. What do you think the likelihood of something like that getting passed is?
I think it's a lot stronger if AMAC is in support of it. American politicians are smart to know that this is a very important voting constituency. And, when they come out to vote and support something, it matters. So the elimination of taxes on Social Security benefits is a big part of it. The no tax on tips is part of it. President Trump obviously wants to incentivize domestic manufacturing and help build up an America first base of manufacturing and industrial base. There's discussion of other economic policies that, Mr. Lutnick would be responsible for at the Commerce Department. So there's quite a bit going on that would certainly affect seniors.
Okay, one follow-up question for you, James, and then we'll move on to Andy. We've heard some relatively dramatic ideas, like we can defund the Department of Education. Just for those of us who aren't as steeped in the policy, is that something that President Trump could do via executive order, or will he need legislative approval for some actions like that?
President Trump would need some legislative approval for some actions like that. There are offices and government efforts that were created surely through executive action, and the president has broad discretion over that. He has the power to reorganize his White House kind of however he wants to. But some of these agencies that have come into creation through acts of Congress will require some legislative action to affect them. That being said, there's an enormous amount that the president can do to influence those agencies, including reducing their budget or proposing budgets that alter their budget significantly, making sure that the grants and the funds and the contracts that these agencies give out, which end up being a tremendous impact on our economy, are not going to promote kind of left-wing ideologies, whether those are kind of climate change ideologies or any kind of social engineering ideologies, but instead are focused on really improving education, for example, for children, and transferring responsibilities back to state and local governments and those who are close to parents. So there's quite a bit that can be done without legislative action, but ultimately some of these agencies will require some legislative action to fulfill, to really eliminate.
And you brought up a good point that I have to ask about, and I saw that one of our attendees was wondering about it as well. What about the new department known as DOGE that Elon Musk and Vivek are heading up that will create more government efficiency?
Absolutely. I would point everyone to, I believe, their article in the Wall Street Journal. They just, I believe it was today, it might have been yesterday, where they talk a little bit about what they're going to do. There's a lot of transformation that can be made within the government, and their idea is to act in an advisory role and pointing out government waste, silly expenditures, or offensive expenditures that the government makes, whether those are in contracting or others. Reductions in force, for example, that can be done agency-wide if to reduce the size of the government. I know they want to reduce the size of the government, which is an incredible cost in the American taxpayer. And certainly many taxpayers can ask what they're receiving in return for that incredible cost. And so they kind of lay out a little bit about their plans, but following up on contracts, making sure that there's not waste, auditing. Some of these big audits have come back as pointing out major problems, major waste, and really just through reductions in force, through focusing on some of these contracts and some of this government waste, we can achieve a lot to get our fiscal house in order.
Really helpful, James. Thank you for that deep dive into what we can expect. Andy, AMAC action is going to play a critical role both at the federal level as well as the state level in 2025. Could you share a little bit about what some of your top priorities will be in this new year?
Absolutely. Excuse me. AMAC Action is an organization that is, we work at the behest of our members. They drive our legislative issue. And with regard to, that's why election integrity ended up in our portfolio. And now we won a battle with regard to election integrity, but the war still rages, particularly for election integrity in some states. They're still counting votes, for goodness sakes, right now. I expect a busy start to the year once these state legislatures open and look to be especially active in Arizona, Alaska, and North Carolina on election integrity issues. On the federal level, there's a healthy appetite for pharmacy benefit manager reform in both the public and private sectors, which would lower drug costs for all Americans, including seniors on Medicare. And we're going to work to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, which had a disastrous effect on seniors' Medicare Part D drug benefit. And we're also going to be focusing on protecting seniors from scams that rob them of their life savings. This is just to name a few, Brittany.
Amazing. And for those who would like to get involved on the AMAC action side of things, how could they get more involved?
Well, they can learn all about our advocacy at www.amacaction.org. And they can learn about our volunteer delegate program, which would put you in direct contact with your local congressional district office. They could learn about our call to action campaigns that are open to AMAC members and how we sporadically deploy them throughout the year on the state and on the federal level, and how their participation really gets their voice heard.
Amazing. Sam, I want to end with one question for you, and then we'll take as many questions as we can get to. We saw in this election, again, historic shifts. And one question I would have for you is, do you think that in this election, this was just a, quote, Trump factor? Or is there something about his policy agenda that is attracting a more diverse group of voters that other Republicans and conservatives can lean into in the future?
Yeah, and I actually don't think it's an or question. I think it's an and answer. I think it's a President Trump effect and his policy agenda, because I think what a lot of people, and you saw a lot of Democrats and independents voting for President Trump, people who historically, are not the biggest fans of President Trump. But what President Trump has been able to do is, you have to realize one thing. People may not like what he says or how he says it, but they love his policies. They love that world leaders respect him. They love, lower taxes, groceries they can actually afford, not $9 eggs. What a concept. but you don't get those policies without that personality. And so I think what President Trump started is going to continue, because for the first time, so many people woke up and said, wow, there's another option for me. So I think no matter who, that kind of mantle is going to go to, there's a really bright future. You look at a lot of his cabinet members, I think, other than the most recent ones that were just announced, a lot of his cabinet members are between the age of 40 and 55. It's a young cabinet, and it's a bright future for the America First movement, but you don't get that bright future without the groundwork that President Trump has laid. And so I'm excited that not only do we have, the current moment, but I think because of these partnerships that we talked about, briefly on the call earlier, that first 100 days, it's going to be important for that, and making sure President Trump's nominees, get confirmed, making sure his policy agenda gets confirmed, making sure we meet the moment as far as the mandate that the American people have given us. But it's also important that this coalition we've built lives on. And I know we're going to continue to work with people like AMAC and other groups, but that work already starts for 2026. We're already starting for 2028. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. And this is the beginning of a 100-year play.
Amazing. That was a great note to end on. And we'll start with this question. And I think it's going to be a question for you, James. Someone asked, what actions can President Trump initiate immediately by executive order without legislation? And I know you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you could give a couple of specific examples of the types of things that he might be able to do immediately.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I would point back to, reinstating a lot of the things that he did last time. Something that's so important is government reform. And Elon and Vivek's project touches on that in their article yesterday. But, reclassification of federal employees as political will give so much more ability to ensure alignment with the president's vision, which is so important. It wasn't meant to be that the executive branch was at war with itself, or there was some kind of cadre within it that was opposed to the vision of the president. The executive branch was to pursue the president's vision, and the president, of course, is elected by all the American people. So that makes sense. So I think that's very exciting. As I talked about, immediately the president can reinstate, the Remain in Mexico policy for asylum seekers, can begin to direct federal funds and resources towards the border wall, can, reinstate agreements that, the Biden administration created a lot of proposals and permitted a lot of folks to kind of stay here in a undocumented status against the law. And so President Trump can certainly enforce the laws that are on the books. For energy policy, he can immediately stop restrictions on domestic oil and gas drilling. For example, President Biden put in a ban on liquefied natural gas, which really affects us down here in the South, where quite a bit of LNG is generated. And, for no good reason, except for the, climate change extremists. And so President Trump can immediately speed up efforts to continue that and to reopen pipelines like the Keystone Pipeline. And for social policy, there's a lot of policies out there, whether it's critical race theory, radical gender ideology, or other policies that are just, in the executive branch and put forward through executive orders. President Trump can immediately reverse those and say, we're not going to support these policies. And some of those policies that Sam talked on, such as, sports policies, gender policies, things like that. So those are all several areas where immediately you're going to see a change without the need for legislation.
Really helpful, James. We actually have a similar follow-up question, which is basically, are the fiscal and physical resources to finish building the wall already in place? Like, could the president, for instance, do that by executive order?
I think for that, the president's not going to need an executive order. I really think that there's a widespread realization, even in both parties. If you start looking at the polls, and Sam would know this better than me, but the fact of the matter is, 10 years ago, 8 years ago, the Democrats were heavily opposed to any immigration enforcement. They were opposed to the border wall. They were opposed to everything that President Trump first raised. And now majorities of all of these groups support these policies. So I really think that Congress will take action to ensure the funding is in place. Last time, President Trump did do some creative things to ensure that some of the, to begin the building of the wall. which immediately the Democrats stopped. But I really do believe that this time around, there's going to be widespread support for these policies.
Yeah, and if
Really
I could
helpful. Thank
jump
you.
in on what James said real quick on the wall, especially one of the things that you saw between 2016 and now was a change in messaging, and we realized how much messaging matters. And so one of the things that we pulled wasn't just issues, but how we talk about issues. So instead of just saying build the wall, which had about a 45% support for and a 55% support against, but when you change the framing to, you know, secure the border, end human trafficking, and defeat the drug cartels, all of a sudden that's an 80% issue that most Americans support. And so that's great things that, you know, we share with our AMAC friends, and I think that they distribute a lot of those to you all to learn how to talk about these issues. But when you focus on the framing and what's important to the American people, you actually see a lot more people are on our side than are willing to admit kind of publicly.
Really interesting, Sam. Thank you. Another question from one of our viewers is, do you think the Trump administration has any plans to pay down our $35 trillion debt?
Well, I think that, you know, Elon Musk has already talked about cutting government waste to the tunes of billions and trillions of dollars. I think it's an urgent issue that both parties need to focus on, and certainly I think President Trump is aware of it, and I do think Elon and Vivek will have some good plans for that. But it's essential that we deal with that for our future. I also am committed to the future. We have a little baby on the way in just a few days. My wife is pregnant. I did want to point out that I do have a lovely Babies for Trump romper ready for him as he steps into a new and wonderful world under this upcoming administration.
Amazing. Congratulations, James. That's so incredible. Can't wait to meet the little one. I think we have time for just a few more questions. So let me look here and make sure I haven't missed anything. One of the questions that someone asked is this. It says, I'm from Save the East Coast, and we are against offshore wind turbines that the Biden administration wants to install along our shores. President Trump said he will stop this on day one. How likely is it that he will do that?
Yes, so this is an issue that's come up. These wind turbines that the environmentalists say are the solution to our problems are actually posing environmental problems, whether it's harming birds or harming whales and disrupting the ecosystem. And so I believe the president's tracking on it. Whether or not that's a day one project or a longer project, I know that there's a lot of sympathy for that issue. So I would imagine it will be addressed.
Yeah, and he's actually done that before. You know, I come from the free state of Florida. And one of the things that President Trump did during his previous time in office was about offshore drilling. So a little bit of a different issue, but the state of Florida said, we don't want offshore drilling. We love our beaches. You know, as much as we love oil, we just don't want it in our house. But states like Louisiana are like, yes, drill, baby, drill. So what he did was he allowed the states that wanted to offshore drill and didn't you know, so I really think that he gives the power back to the American people. He's done it before, and I anticipate that he'll be doing that again.
Really helpful. And Sam, I think this is another question for you as well. Another viewer asked about the fact that oftentimes we see that younger voters become more conservative over time. What does this election cycle reveal about some of the younger voters that we're seeing now?
I think you saw a lot of younger voters. It'll be interesting as we analyze the why behind the Trump vote. But I think a lot of it was one of two reasons. I think it was people saying, I want to buy a house. I want to eat something other than ramen noodles. I can't afford eggs or milk anymore. You know, and I want to have a family one day. And it's really hard to afford anything right now. Imagine trying to be a college student, trying to get an apartment under this Biden economy. It's just next to impossible. And I think the other part of it was a little bit of rebellion. And I think we can't ignore that. And I think those younger voters who did vote for President Trump, maybe out of rebellion, those are voters we really have to focus on, because they have to now realize it's not good enough to just be rebellious once. And they now have to realize what they voted for. I think you saw a lot of that in 2016 that you didn't see in 2020. You had a lot of people voting for President Trump in 2016, maybe not because they loved him, but because they could never vote for someone who didn't pick up the phone during Benghazi. I think you saw that in 2024 of they were never going to vote for someone who left Americans behind in Afghanistan. I think you see a lot of those rebellion, especially those younger voters who have been told, oh, you have to vote a certain way. You're young, you have to vote a certain way. You hear it all the time from the media. And I think they're going, wait a second, no, you don't. I'm my own individual person. I think that's what makes America great. So I think you see a little bit of those demographic shifts, but for different reasons. And I think speaking of younger voters, and James brought up the onesie, I think we need some future AMAC member onesies. I would like to see those. I think they'd be great.
Great idea. Thank you, Sam. We should hire you on our marketing team. But we'll end with a final question for Andy, which is very important. One of our AMAC members has asked, will the issue of Social Security funding be addressed by the new Congress and by President Trump?
Well, we certainly hope so. And we're certainly going to ask. We think, and I mentioned before, there's an appetite for PBM reform. We think that there's an appetite based on some of the meetings we've had with members of the Senate to fix Social Security. And I'm curious, with all the money that Vivek and Ilan are going to save, is particularly if the Department of Education goes away, I would believe and hope that the Trump administration would redirect those funds to not only paying down the debt, but to shoring up Social Security. But yeah, I think there's going to be an appetite for it. We will certainly ask to make sure that there's an appetite for it and present options that we've developed over the past 10 or 12 years that we have been talking about on Capitol Hill. We've presented these options as recently as this year. There's a lot of interest in our ideas. We know there's more than one way to skin this cat, if you will. But yeah, we believe that there's going to be an opportunity to take a look at long-term Social Security solvency and to address the problem of insolvency. We only have 9 or 10 years before the trust fund reverts to a cash-in, cash-out basis. So something definitely has to be done.
Thank you, Andy. Well, I want to thank Sam, Andy, and James for your expertise today. I can already see from many of the comments that our members are really grateful for the information that you've provided them. And I'd like to invite Jolene on to say a few closing words, the executive director of the AMAC Foundation. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the foundation, we'd love for you to learn more, get more involved, and always to support our great work. So thank you very much for being here today. And we look forward to offering more informational sessions like this in the near future. Jolene?
Thank you, everybody. That was excellent. I hope everyone not only learned something, maybe your question was answered, but thank you for attending. We have a great turnout. And I just want to also mention that the AMAC Foundation wants to continue to deliver important hot topics such as this, information education for all. And if you would consider a donation, we would appreciate that. There is a link in the chat. It is wonderful that we can bring panelists together, bring the community together, and just continue to educate everyone. Thank you very much for your time and joining us today. And again, thank you guys. That was excellent.